They said it so casually, I almost mistook it for background noise. The kind of offhand remark people toss into the air when they believe it will dissolve before it lands. But it didn't dissolve. Not for me. Not when my son leaned back in his leather chair and murmured almost kindly, almost apologetically, "He's too slow, Mom. I can't hire him. He'll embarrass the firm." Those words hung in the room like smoke, like something sour that seeps into curtains and hair and skin. And even though he was already reaching for his phone, already half gone in that brisk, efficient way of his, I stood there, feeling every syllable like a tap of a hammer on thin glass. My grandson, my quiet, gentle boy, and the man who said it without blinking was the very child I once carried home through winter storms, wrapped inside my coat so his ears wouldn't freeze. I remember thinking, not for the first time, how strange it is when tenderness grows into cruelty. Not loud cruelty, nothing so convenient, but the kind that arrives in neat sentences spoken in tasteful offices with framed degrees and curated lighting. Cruelty that looks like professionalism, like maturity, like reason. I left his office with a tight smile, the kind I've perfected over decades of being spoken to like a mildly malfunctioning appliance. Nothing broken enough to throw away, but enough of a nuisance to keep in the basement. The receptionist wished me a lovely afternoon. I wished her one back. There is a choreography to invisibility, and older women learn it the way children learn the alphabet, by repetition and necessity. Outside, the sun was warm in that early spring way, generous but still carrying a hint of frost along its edges. And I stood there for a moment on the sidewalk trying to catch my breath, because my body knew before my mind did that something had shifted. Something fundamental, something that had been quietly cracking for years had finally given way. When I got home, my grandson was sitting at my kitchen table with his notebook, the one with the dog-eared corners and little sketches in the margins that he never shows anyone on purpose. He looked up at me with that open, painfully trusting face of his, the kind that still believes people mean what they say and say what they mean. He asked me how it went, not with hope, not even with expectation, but with that soft hesitation of someone who has learned to brace himself for disappointment long before it arrives. I wanted to tell him a story, something sweet, something bearable, but the lie caught in my throat, refusing to cooperate. So I told him the truth gently, carefully, like handing a glass object to a child. He blinked once, twice, and then he nodded as if receiving a verdict he already knew by heart, and he tried to smile, but the corners of his mouth twitched downward first, betraying the hurt before he could hide it. That was the moment, not when my son said it, but when my grandson quietly accepted it, that I felt something inside me tighten like a fist. He excused himself. He always excuses himself, and went out to the garage, where he keeps boxes of parts no one respects and tools no one understands. Through the window, I could see him hover over the workbench, shoulders rounded, hands unsure of where to land. That same slump he used to have at 11, when his teachers told me he was bright but behind, as if human beings mature on conveyor belts, and he had simply missed his stop. I leaned against the counter trying to steady myself, letting the familiar hum of the refrigerator fill the silence, and I felt suddenly older than my 78 years, older than all the rooms I have ever cleaned and all the meals I have ever cooked, older than the grief I carry for my late husband, older than the disappointments that have settled into my bones like sediment. I realized then that what hurt wasn't the insult. God knows I've lived long enough to develop thick skin. But the ease with which my son said it, The ease with which he dismissed his own nephew. The ease with which he expected me to agree, to join him. In that polished world where worth is measured by speed, confidence, and the ability to charm a boardroom. When did he become a man who saw slowness as a defect rather than a different rhythm? When did the world convince him that empathy was a liability? When did I lose him? I don't remember the exact year, the exact argument, the exact silence that stretched too long to be bridged again. These things don't happen like in the movies, with slammed doors and final scenes. They happen like erosion, imperceptible, until you're suddenly standing in a landscape you don't recognize. I sat down at the table, resting my hand on the spot where my grandson's notebook had been, and I forced myself to breathe slowly. He came back in eventually, quiet as always, smelling of machine oil and sawdust, and that electric warmth that clings to people who spend their lives tinkering. He tried to pretend nothing had happened, asked if I wanted tea, and his voice trembled, just barely, the way a leaf trembles in a breeze too soft to feel. I said yes, even though I wasn't thirsty, because saying yes was a way of keeping him close, of anchoring him to the moment instead of letting him drift into that lonely place. I know he goes when he feels unworthy. He poured the water too soon. The kettle hadn't fully boiled, and the tea came out pale and thin, floating weakly at the top, like it didn't have the courage to steep properly. I drank it anyway. I drank every drop. Because love sometimes looks like drinking badly made tea in a quiet kitchen at dusk, while pretending that your heart isn't breaking for a boy the world refuses to understand. He sat across from me and asked, almost in a whisper, whether I thought he really was slow. I felt the question like a blow, a direct, sharp one, and I had to take a moment before answering, because the truth I wanted to give him had to be wrapped carefully so it wouldn't cut him. I told him no, of course not, that people move at different tempos, that some minds bloom like spring flowers and others like winter ones, slow, stubborn, beautiful in their own unhurried way. He listened, nodding, but I could see doubt flickering in him like a weakening bulb. That's the cruelty of labels. Once spoken, they echo. When he went to bed that night, I walked through the house turning off lights, touching the backs of chairs, smoothing the edges of blankets, doing all the small rituals I do when I need to calm myself. And as I folded the throw at the foot of the sofa, I felt a thought settle into me with such clarity that it was almost a physical sensation. If my grandson doubted himself, it was because the people who should have lifted him had instead treated him like extra weight. And if I didn't do something real, something irreversible, then he would carry that doubt for the rest of his life like a stone in his pocket. So when I finally sat on my bed in the dim light of the lamp, hands resting loosely in my lap, I realized that this wasn't just the story of a boy being underestimated. It was the story of a woman who had spent her whole life swallowing words to keep peace, who had been small to make others comfortable, who had taught her son to be strong, but had forgotten somehow to teach him to be kind. And now here I was, standing at a crossroads with more years behind me than ahead, knowing that what I chose to do next would shape a young man's future in ways he could not yet imagine. It began with a sentence spoken too easily in a polished office. But the rest, that was going to be mine to write. I didn't sleep that night, though I kept my eyes closed long enough to pretend I had, because sometimes pretending is easier for the body than accepting the truth that keeps you awake. Morning came slowly, with that pale, washed-out kind of sunlight that slips around the edges of curtains like it's apologizing for intruding. I moved through the kitchen in the old rhythm, kettle, cups, the creak of the third floorboard from the door, and I tried to convince myself that yesterday had been nothing more than an unpleasant conversation, an unfortunate opinion, voiced without thinking, something that would soften with time. But the truth sat under my breastbone like a cold stone, and even the rising steam couldn't warm me from it. My grandson emerged from his room with that hesitant step that has followed him since childhood, a quiet way of entering spaces as if asking permission, even now at 23. His hair stuck up on one side, his shirt was inside out, and there was a smudge of oil on his wrist he must have forgotten to wash off. He apologized by reflex, apologized like breathing, and asked if I needed help with anything. I shook my head because I didn't trust my voice. He poured himself cereal and ate without looking up, and the silence between us stretched thin and fragile, a tightrope I didn't know how to cross without breaking. Then the phone rang. I didn't want to answer it, not because I didn't know who it was, but because I did. My son's name glowed on the screen like an accusation. I picked it up with a voice I hoped sounded neutral. He didn't bother with greetings. He launched straight into the matter, explaining that he'd thought about it overnight and wanted to be clear before this goes any further. He said he didn't want to mislead anyone, especially me, and that the firm simply wasn't the right environment for someone like my grandson. He said it with the tone of a man who believes he is being compassionate when in truth he is delivering a verdict he has already rehearsed to himself enough times that it feels merciful. I asked him what he meant by someone like him, though deep down I already knew. He sighed, that impatient sigh adults use with children who ask questions they don't want to answer, and launched into a practiced explanation about performance metrics and productivity standards and neurotypical expectations, as if human beings were machines calibrated on assembly lines. He said the world was competitive, cruel even, and he refused to set the boy up for failure. He said it as though denying him a chance was an act of love. I glanced at my grandson sitting silently at the table, shoulders tight, spoon paused halfway to his mouth, pretending he wasn't listening, when every muscle in his face revealed that he was absorbing each word like a blow. My son continued, saying that he had spoken to some colleagues, that they agreed it would be too much responsibility to bring on someone who struggles with basic social communication. He reminded me how, as a child, my grandson took longer to read, longer to speak, longer to process instructions, as though slowness were a defect instead of a way of being. He said, "He's a nice kid, Mom, but he's not built for the adult world." And I felt something sharp twist inside me, something that had been dormant for years, something close to fury but deeper, older, almost maternal in its ferocity. I asked him if he remembered the doctors who once told me he, my son, had delayed emotional development when he was 10, how they had recommended patience and support instead of shame. He brushed it off, said that wasn't the same thing, said he grew out of it, as if compassion were a childhood illness one could outgrow. I tried to remind him that not everyone moves through the world with the same pace or noise or confidence, but he cut me off, saying he didn't have time for this. He said I was being sentimental, that I let my affection cloud my judgment, that I didn't understand the realities of modern work. And then he said the sentence that turned the stone in my chest into a crack, spreading outward. "Mom, he's fragile. Fragile people need limits." The conversation ended, not because we resolved anything, but because he ended it, the way he always does when the discussion stops orbiting his comfort. He told me not to give the boy false hope and hung up with the brisk efficiency of someone closing a transaction. I stood there for a moment with the phone pressed to my ear even after the line went dead, as if waiting for the world to shift into a shape that made more sense than the one I was holding. My grandson finally spoke, his voice small and careful. "It's okay, Grandma." I didn't really expect him to say yes. He said it with a half smile that collapsed almost immediately, and then he added, in that painfully earnest way of his, "Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm not good enough for that kind of job." He didn't say it dramatically. He said it like someone acknowledging the weather, something inevitable, something that couldn't be changed no matter how much you wished it would. I walked to him and put my hand on his shoulder, felt the tension there, the years of internalized doubt packed into the muscles of a young man who had been quiet for so long. People mistook it for emptiness instead of depth. I told him he was good enough, better than good enough, but my words felt thin, like trying to mend a crack with air. He nodded politely, the way people nod when they don't believe you but don't want to argue. When he went back to the garage, I stood at the sink watching him through the window as he moved around the workbench with slow precision, the kind of methodical focus that some people call a limitation, simply because they don't recognize it as a talent. I saw him wipe his eyes with the back of his hand when he thought no one was looking. He picked up a circuit board, stared at it like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world, and began to work again, gently, carefully, with a tenderness I've only ever seen in people who feel deeply, even when the world insists they feel wrong. That was when the truth settled on me fully, without mercy and without disguise. This wasn't a misunderstanding, not a momentary lapse of kindness, not a bad day or an overreaction. This was a door being closed in his face by a man who had once relied on my hands to hold him steady when he learned to walk. And it struck me that my son, the successful professional with the nice office and the quick voice, had forgotten something essential, that people bloom when they are believed in and wither when they are dismissed. And as I watched my grandson solder tiny wires with shaking hands, I understood that my role from this moment on would not be to plead with the world on his behalf, nor to wait for his uncle to see him. My role would be to stand between him and the cruelty of expectations that had nothing to do with who he really was. I realized, with a clarity that made my breath catch, that the moment my son said, "He's too slow," something in me woke up that had been quiet for years, the fierce, unyielding instinct to protect what the world does not understand. That was the moment the story truly began. The moment something shifted irreversibly, not with fireworks or declarations, but with the soft, shattering sound of a young man quietly believing he might be worthless, and an old woman deciding, finally, fully, that she would not let him carry that belief another step into his future. In the days that followed, something in the house shifted in a way that wasn't immediately visible, the kind of shift you notice only when you realize the air has changed texture, as if someone opened a window in another room and let in a draft that you keep trying to ignore. My grandson began waking earlier than usual, before dawn most mornings, moving with that quiet, deliberate slowness of his, as though he had to negotiate every step with the world around him. He would eat whatever I put in front of him without complaint, not because he wasn't hungry, but because hunger had become something he learned to carry gently, the way one carries fragile hope, afraid any sudden movement might break it. He didn't speak much, not that he ever did, but there was a difference now, a kind of tightened stillness inside him, as though he had tucked his heart into some back corner where no one could touch it. I would hear him in the garage, the low hum of tools starting and stopping, the faint scrape of metal against metal, the occasional clatter when something slipped or rolled. He stayed there for hours, sometimes forgetting to come in for lunch, sometimes emerging only when dusk had soaked the yard in that blue-gray light that makes everything look softer than it really is. At first, I thought he was simply trying to distract himself, trying to lose the sting of rejection in the certainty of familiar motions. But then I began to notice a pattern in his movements. He wasn't tinkering aimlessly the way bored young men sometimes do. He was working with a quiet, intense concentration that bordered on reverence. He would disassemble something, lay each piece in a precise line across the workbench, study the pattern like it held some secret only he might see, then put it together again with a patience that made my throat tighten. There was a deliberateness to it, a kind of solitary discipline, but also an ache that pulsed through every gesture. The ache of someone who had been told too many times he was lacking and was now trying to build a world where his hands could prove otherwise. I watched him from the window more often than I care to admit, carrying a dish towel in my hands so I could pretend I was doing something useful instead of standing guard in my own quiet way. His shoulders would rise and fall with each breath, sometimes slowly as though he were calming himself, sometimes in quick, sharp movements when frustration seized him. There were moments when he would grip the edge of the table so tightly I could see the tension all the way from the kitchen. Moments when he would step back, rub his forehead, close his eyes, and breathe like someone trying not to break. And then he would return to the work, steadying his hands with a kind of stubborn gentleness that nearly brought me to tears. Meanwhile, the calls from my son came less frequently, but carried more weight each time, as though the distance between us had become something he could throw words across only if he used enough force. He asked me if the boy was coping well, saying it in a tone that suggested coping was the ceiling he expected my grandson to reach. He suggested that maybe I should encourage him to pick something simple, maybe retail, maybe warehouse work, maybe something that doesn't require too much cognitive strain. He spoke of his nephew as if he were a fragile machine, one that might overheat if used for anything beyond the lowest setting. And though I tried to keep my replies measured, something inside me grew tauter each time. The kind of tension that builds not from anger, but from relentless disbelief that someone you raised could look at the world with so little mercy. I didn't tell him about the long hours in the garage, about the quiet determination that clung to my grandson like a second skin, about the way he studied diagrams and manuals late into the night by the weak light of the old lamp Derek once used to fix radios in the basement. I didn't tell him because I knew he would dismiss it, call it a phase, call it wishful thinking, say that tinkering wasn't a career path and that some people were just meant to live small, comfortable lives where no one expected too much of them. I didn't tell him because his disbelief would have done more harm than his silence ever could. One evening, I stepped into the garage without warning, something I rarely did because I understood how sacred that space was to him, how it was the one place where he didn't have to measure his movements or adjust his expressions to match someone else's expectations. He was hunched over the table with a soldering iron, his face illuminated by the thin line of the bulb above, sweat glinting lightly along his hairline. He didn't hear me at first, which wasn't unusual. He always disappeared into his work with a kind of full-body focus that reminded me of children building sandcastles, utterly lost in the fragile architecture of their imagination. When he finally looked up, there was a flicker of something like embarrassment in his eyes, as if he had been caught doing something he wasn't meant to. I told him I was just checking in, that he missed dinner, that I had saved him a plate. He murmured an apology, but his voice was distant, still tethered to whatever problem his hands were trying to solve. I moved closer and noticed the object on the table, something small, intricate, wires extending from it like delicate veins. a tiny motor resting beside it. I asked him what it was, and he shrugged in that shy way of his, saying he didn't know if it would work, saying it was probably nothing, saying he just wanted to see if certain things could talk to each other. His words halting, but his eyes glowing, with a kind of quiet fire I hadn't seen in years. I asked if he needed anything, tools, parts, money, and he shook his head quickly, almost defensively, as if asking for help would make him appear even smaller in a world that already insisted he was insufficient. I placed a hand on his shoulder, felt the tension bunch beneath my palm, and told him gently that building things out of nothing was never nothing, that trying was not something to be ashamed of. He nodded, but I could see he didn't believe me. Not yet. In those weeks, the house became divided into two worlds: the bright, ordinary rooms where I cooked and cleaned and kept the rhythms that had sustained me through decades of quiet survival, and the garage, where something new was being forged from, the remnants of discarded machines and a young man's wounded resolve. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear him still awake, moving around in his room or padding softly toward the kitchen for water, and I would lie there listening, imagining the thoughts threading themselves through his mind. I knew he was replaying his uncle's words, the ones said so carelessly, the ones that lodged themselves like thorns beneath the skin. I knew he was weighing them, letting them echo in that deep, private space where doubt grows fastest. And each time I heard those quiet movements, I would whisper into the dark a kind of prayer. Not the religious kind, but the human kind. The one that asks the universe to cradle someone gently when you cannot. The real escalation, though, happened not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow accumulation of small ones, the way a shoreline erodes grain by grain until one day the land you thought would hold forever has shifted completely. My grandson stopped asking for his uncle's approval. He stopped checking his phone. He stopped flinching when messages came in. Instead, he poured himself more fully into whatever he was building, letting the garage swallow him whole in the best possible way. And though I worried that he was retreating too deeply into solitude, there was also a new steadiness to him, a sustained effort that felt like a kind of rebellion against the world that had dismissed him. I noticed the changes in myself too, the way I began bracing when the phone rang, the way I began watching my son's name flash on the screen like a warning signal. I answered less often and spoke shorter when I did, offering him little pieces of myself instead of the whole heart I had always given freely. Something in me was pulling back, not out of anger, but out of a dawning recognition that loving someone does not require letting them trample whatever is fragile and precious. And my grandson, slow, methodical, thoughtful, was precious in ways my son had never learned to see. It was during one of those late afternoons, when the house was wrapped in the muted light of a fading day, that I realized the quiet worsening had become something solid, irreversible. My grandson came inside with grease on his hands and tiredness in his shoulders, and when I asked how the project was going, he didn't offer the usual uncertain shrug. Instead, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if some tiny piece of the world had just clicked into place. And I felt then, with both fear and a flicker of fierce hope, that he was on the edge of something neither of us could yet name, something that had begun not despite the rejection but because of it. It happened on an afternoon that began like any other, one of those washed-out midweek days where nothing seems urgent, and the hours blend into one another without sharp edges. And I remember thinking while I folded towels that maybe the world had settled into a tired rhythm I knew too well. My grandson had been in the garage for most of the morning. the door half open to let in a stray breeze that carried the scent of cut grass from the neighbor's yard, and I could hear the faint stutter of something mechanical coming to life. Sputtering, pausing, then starting again with the stubborn insistence of a thing that refused to be discarded. I didn't go out there right away. I had learned to leave him in that fragile state where focus and uncertainty were always wrestling for dominance. Instead, I stayed in the house, moving through tasks that didn't need to be done, but kept my hands busy enough to quiet the anxious knot in my stomach. It was only when the sound changed, when the machine's shaky rhythm became steady, almost confident, that I felt something inside me tighten in recognition, as if a thread that had been loose for months had suddenly been pulled taut. I walked toward the garage slowly, not wanting to break whatever spell he had managed to cast over those stubborn wires and mismatched components he'd salvaged from old radios and broken lawn equipment. He didn't hear me at first, too absorbed in the small device on the table, something no larger than a paperback book with a soft blue light pulsing from its center like a heartbeat. His face was lit by it, and for a moment he looked younger, almost like the child who used to take apart clocks just to see what the ticking sounded like from the inside. I watched him touch the edge of the casing with a hesitant reverence, as though he was afraid the thing might vanish if he looked at it too directly. When he finally noticed me, he didn't scramble to hide what he was doing or brush it off as nothing. Instead, he stepped slightly aside and gestured toward it, an unspoken invitation, the kind of gesture that holds both pride and fear, the fear of being misunderstood once more. I asked him what it was, though I wasn't sure I would grasp the answer, and he explained in the soft, halting way he always did when he'd spent too long alone in his own thoughts. He talked about sensor arrays and electrical feedback loops and something about optimizing the detection of faults in motors before they failed, and though I couldn't repeat a word of it now, I remember the way his voice changed as he spoke. It grew steadier, more certain, as though each sentence he shared added a little weight to his sense of self, a sense he had been missing for so long it had calcified into something brittle. I didn't need to understand the mechanics. I understood him. The way his hands hovered above the device, with a mixture of reverence and doubt. The way he kept glancing at me like he was waiting for the moment I told him it wasn't real. That it wasn't. Enough that it wasn't what the world expected. But I didn't say that. I told him to plug it in, to show me what it did, to let me see what he had made with his own slow, careful hands. He hesitated, his breath catching the way it always did when he reached the edge of vulnerability, but then he flipped a switch, and the little motor on the workbench, a battered thing that had been sitting there untouched for months, began to spin, hesitantly at first, then with a smoothness that surprised even me. The light on his device flashed in a sequence he seemed to understand instinctively, and he leaned in closer, watching it respond, reading it the way other people read faces. He whispered something almost to himself, a tiny confirmation, and then he looked up at me with an expression I had not seen in years, one of recognition, not of me, but of himself. He told me he'd been building toward this without even realizing it, following a feeling rather than a plan, letting the parts teach him rather than forcing them into a design they didn't want to follow. He said it made sense in his head, but he didn't know if it made sense in the real world, and he kept apologizing for not being able to explain it better, as though clarity were the measure of worth. I placed my hand gently on his arm and told him he didn't need to explain it in a way that impressed anyone, least of all the people who didn't believe in him. He only needed to show what he could do, and what he had done already spoke more loudly than anything he could say. He nodded, but the nod was small, cautious, like someone who'd been taught too many times that praise was a trap. I could see him wrestling with the weight of his uncle's judgment, with the years of being told he was too slow, too quiet, too unfocused, too everything that made him who he was. And at that moment, something in him shifted, not dramatically, not like a storm breaking, but like a tide turning slowly and silently, confident that its pull was stronger than any attempt to resist it. He picked up the device again and said that maybe he should test it somewhere outside the garage, maybe at the salvage yard down by the highway. Maybe somewhere real where engines and motors weren't just abandoned, but broken in ways that required attention. It wasn't a bold declaration, nothing like the triumphant announcements people like to attach to moments of transformation. It was quieter than that, anchored in something deeper than confidence, a willingness to step into the world without waiting for permission. I told him I'd drive him, even though he hadn't asked. He shrugged, trying to seem indifferent, but I saw the small relief settle across his face like a softening wind. On the drive there, he stared out the window, fingers tapping against the device resting in his lap. And I realized he wasn't nervous about whether it would work. He was nervous about what it meant that he was finally trying, finally allowing himself to want more than scraps of approval. The salvage yard was loud and grimy and filled with the smell of rust and oil. And for a moment I feared it might overwhelm him. But instead, he walked straight toward an old generator lying haphazardly beside a stack of broken car parts. He knelt beside it, placed the device on the ground, adjusted 2 cables, and waited. It responded. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but enough that his eyes widened and he whispered, "It sees it." I didn't know what that meant, but I didn't need to. I saw the way his breath deepened, the way his shoulders lowered, the way his entire body seemed to recognize itself after so many years of contortion. I saw the way he touched the machine not with uncertainty, but with familiarity, as though something inside him finally aligned with something outside him. And in that moment, standing in a place filled with the broken remains of machines other people had given up on, I understood that this was not merely tinkering or distraction or escape. This was a young man building the architecture of his future, with hands no one had ever trusted to hold such weight. When we got home, he didn't disappear into the garage like before. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, opened his notebook, and began sketching ideas with a focus that transformed his face. He talked quietly about improvements, about tests, about maybe showing it to the mechanic downtown who always complained about faulty sensors. And I realized his voice had changed. It carried intention, not tentative hope, but emerging purpose. And as I watched him write with a steadiness that hadn't been there just weeks before, I felt something shift inside me too. Something that made me sit down, fold my hands, and breathe in a way that felt like unclenching. It wasn't a triumphant moment. There was no dramatic music or sudden certainty. It was simply the quiet realization that the story I had feared would end in resignation was instead turning toward possibility. And for the first time in a long while, I found myself believing we were only at the beginning. The weeks that followed unfolded with that strange mixture of quiet routine and deepening tension that settles over a house when something important is growing in secret, like a seed pushing through soil while storms gather on the horizon. And though nothing dramatic happened at first, I could feel an uneasiness building inside me, a sense that whatever peace we had managed to carve out for ourselves was about to be tested in ways neither of us was prepared for. My grandson continued working on his device every day with a steadiness that bordered on devotion, refining circuits, adjusting sensors, scribbling notes across page after page of his notebook until the ink smudged on his fingers. And he carried himself with a subdued determination that made him seem both older and younger at the same time, older in his seriousness and younger in the fragile hope that flickered behind his eyes each time he spoke of what he was building. I tried not to hover, though my instinct was to watch over him constantly, to shield him from every disappointment. But he needed space to grow into himself, and I understood that meddling would only smother the delicate fire beginning to form inside him. He started taking the device to the mechanic downtown, the one who had always been kind to him in that gruff, distracted way people sometimes are when they see vulnerability, but don't know how to acknowledge it. And one afternoon, he returned with an almost imperceptible brightness in his expression. I didn't pry, but over dinner he mentioned quietly that the mechanic had liked the device, had asked questions, had even asked if he could try it on a couple of other engines the next day. He said it in a tone that tried very hard to be casual, but the lightness in his voice betrayed the truth. Someone had taken him seriously, someone who wasn't obliged to, someone who had nothing to gain by pretending. It was a small victory, but for him it was enormous, like a breath he had been holding for years had finally been released. For a moment it felt as if the world might let him be. But life has a habit of sensing delicate joys and testing them immediately, and the test arrived sooner than I expected. It came first through a phone call from my son, the kind of call where the moment you hear the tone, you know you're about to be scolded for something you didn't do. He asked me what I had allowed the boy to get involved in, and whether I was encouraging unrealistic ambitions. And before I could answer, he launched into a monologue about how dangerous false hope could be, how people like my grandson needed structure, predictable jobs, limited expectations. He said he had heard, through some cousin or neighbor or whoever he keeps around him like satellites, that the boy was messing around with machinery again. And he said it like it was a crime, like creation was inherently irresponsible if it didn't. Follow a corporate blueprint. I told him gently that experimenting was not a crime, that growth required risk, that maybe for once he should offer support rather than skepticism. He sighed in that irritated way of his, the one that always makes me feel as though I have failed him somehow even when I know I haven't, and he warned me that if I kept encouraging nonsense, I would be doing the boy a disservice. I wanted to shout that the only disservice done to him was a lifetime of being told he was slow. But I swallowed the words because yelling at someone who is convinced he is right is like shouting into wind. It takes your breath and changes nothing. Instead, I hung up and stood in the kitchen staring at the quiet, orderly world around me, wondering how it was possible for a mother to feel so foreign to her own child, how a man I had raised with tenderness could grow into someone who treated vulnerability like weakness and creativity like foolishness. I wanted to protect my grandson from all of this, but the truth was that the world outside the garage was beginning to intrude whether we wanted it to or not. The second wave came in the form of rumors that drifted through our small town faster than wind can carry leaves. People were talking about the young man who was building strange contraptions, about a device no one understood that he had taken to the salvage yard, about how he had always been a bit off, how it was sweet that he was trying, but perhaps not entirely safe. Some of it was harmless gossip, nothing more than idle curiosity dressed up as concern, but some of it had teeth. One neighbor suggested quietly that I should keep an eye on him, implying he might harm himself or someone else. Another asked if I had spoken to a therapist about his condition. They used words like delicate, troubled, unstable, words spoken in hushed tones by people who think whispering makes cruelty softer. I smiled politely and went back home with my groceries. But inside my chest, something sharp was forming, something protective and fierce, because I could see that the closer he came to finding himself, the more uncomfortable it made people who had already decided who he was supposed to be. But the real escalation arrived the day my son decided to come in person, unannounced, as if he had the right to step back into our world simply because he disapproved of what was developing in it. I opened the door to find him standing there in his tailored coat, his expression tight with that particular blend of irritation and self-righteous concern that successful people wear when they believe they are delivering wisdom. He said he needed to talk sense into the boy, and before I could stop him, he walked straight toward the garage with a confidence that made me want to grab him by the collar. I followed, nerves tightening with every step, praying silently that my grandson wouldn't be shattered by whatever careless remarks might come next. He was in the middle of testing something, crouched over the workbench, completely absorbed, and when he looked up and saw his uncle, his expression changed so quickly from focus to panic that it nearly broke me. My son took in the cluttered space with a disdainful glance, the kind of glance someone gives to a room filled with abandoned dreams, and he launched immediately into a speech about responsibility, stability, normalcy, about how playing with junk wouldn't lead anywhere, about how he needed to stop wasting time and consider a job that suited his limitations. He said all of this as if my grandson were deaf or numb, as if he could not feel each word like a blunt impact to the chest. My grandson stared at the floor, shoulders tightening, jaw clenching in that silent way he has when he's trying not to cry, and I felt a rage rising in me so fast it made my vision blur. I told my son to stop. He ignored me. He reached for the device on the table without asking, turned it over roughly, inspected it with the careless curiosity of someone who sees no value in what he holds. He said it looked fragile, amateur, nothing that would hold up in a real environment. My grandson whispered that he was still improving it, that he had new ideas for testing, and my son laughed, not loudly, but just enough to make the air in the room change temperature. He asked him who would ever buy something like this, who would trust someone who couldn't even hold eye contact for more than a few seconds, who would invest in a project built by a boy who had always needed extra time, extra help, extra everything. My grandson stepped back as though he had been physically struck, and I, my hands shaking, told my son to leave the garage. He tried to argue, saying he was only trying to help, that he was the only one who saw reality clearly, that I was filling the boy's head with illusions, but I didn't budge. I told him again to leave, and this time my voice carried enough steel that even he recognized he had crossed a line. He left the garage with a dismissive wave, muttering something about my overly emotional tendencies. And for a few seconds, the world stood still, filled only with the pulsing sound of my grandson's uneven breathing. When he finally looked up at me, there was something different in his eyes, not just hurt, but a quiet, growing resolve, like a small flame gaining strength in a soft wind. He didn't say anything for a long time, just stood there in the dim light with his device resting on the table between us like a fragile promise. Then he said, in a voice so steady it shocked me, that he didn't care anymore what his uncle thought, that he didn't care what people whispered, that he was tired of apologizing for the way he was made. He said he wanted to finish his prototype, that he wanted to test it everywhere he could, that he wanted to see, not hope, not imagine, but see, whether his hands could build something the world needed. It was in that moment, watching him straighten his shoulders and lift his chin, that I realized the escalation wasn't in the cruelty coming from outside. It was in the strength rising inside him, a strength I had feared he would never find because everyone had spent so long telling him he had none. It scared me and amazed me all at once, because strength born from wounds is a dangerous, powerful thing, the kind that refuses to be silenced again. And as I stood there in the cluttered garage, feeling the remnants of anger and pride thrum through me, I understood that the calm we had known before was gone forever, that the world was circling closer now, watching, judging, preparing to interfere again. But I also understood that he was no longer the fragile boy they believed him to be. Something had awakened in him, something slow burning and unstoppable, and I felt myself unclench in a way I hadn't in years. Because for the first time, he wasn't shrinking from the world's expectations. He was preparing, quietly and deliberately, to prove them wrong. It happened on a morning that began in absolute stillness, the sort of stillness that comes not from peace, but from a pressure building so quietly that you only recognize it when it finally breaks. And I remember standing at the kitchen sink washing, a mug that didn't need washing, my hands moving automatically while my mind circled the same questions that had haunted me for months. How far could I protect him? How much longer could his gentleness survive against the world's certainty? And when, if ever, would he finally choose himself over their expectations? He came downstairs later than usual, not with the weary slump that had once been his constant posture, but with a focus that sharpened his entire presence, something almost electric running beneath his skin. And he told me in that low, deliberate voice of his that he had decided in the kind of final way that leaves no room for hesitation, that he was ready to show the device to people who might actually understand it, people who could see its value beyond the limits others had assigned. To him, he said he had been invited to a small engineering meetup in the city, nothing official, nothing grand, just a gathering of independent builders and mechanics and hobby-level inventors, and he wanted to bring his prototype, demonstrate it, ask for feedback, maybe even hear whether it had real potential. He said all of this without meeting my eyes, not because he was hiding, but because he was protecting something fragile inside himself, something he feared might shatter if exposed too soon. I offered to drive him, but he shook his head gently, saying he needed to do this part alone, that showing up without me hovering would make him feel more like an adult, and I felt a small ache in my chest, because I knew he was right. So I packed him lunch anyway, slipped a note into the bag, telling him how proud I was, and watched him walk down the driveway with the device cradled in both hands, like a living thing he had nurtured into existence. The day stretched painfully slow after that. I tried distracting myself with chores, with gardening, with old letters I had been meaning to organize, but everything felt flimsy, unreal, because part of me was walking beside him into that crowded space, carrying his fears, carrying his hopes, carrying the weight of every moment he had been dismissed or diminished. Hours passed without word, and I told myself not to worry, that he was fine, that the world could not break someone who had finally begun to believe in the value of his own mind. But by late afternoon, my nerves coiled so tightly that even the ticking of the clock sounded like a warning, and when the front door finally opened, I nearly dropped the plate I was holding. He stepped inside quietly, his face flushed from cold air and nerves, and for a terrifying moment, I couldn't read his expression. Then he exhaled a long, trembling breath and said, with a shock of disbelief coloring his voice, that they had loved it, really loved it. Loved not just the function, but the design, the simplicity, the clarity of his thinking hidden beneath layers of hesitation. He said men who had been building machines for decades had crowded around him, asking questions, offering suggestions, telling him he had something genuinely new on his hands. One even invited him to bring it to a larger event the following week, something semi-professional, something where small investors and technical people walked around looking for ideas that might be worth nurturing. He told me all this standing in the doorway with his coat still on, hands shaking. Not from fear now, but from adrenaline, from disbelief, from the strange sensation of being seen entirely for the first time in his life without the filter of slow or different or behind. But the shift, the real shift, happened when he said he had decided to make an official presentation, slides, diagrams, a demonstration in front of strangers. He said he wanted to show them what he had built, wanted to let the device speak for him in ways he had never been able to find the words. He said he knew it would be terrifying, but for once the fear felt like a door instead of a wall. I helped him rehearse for days, though I knew nothing about the technical details. I asked him to explain it to me again and again, not because I needed to understand, but because he needed to practice saying the words out loud without flinching. There were nights he fell asleep over the table, and I would drape a blanket over his shoulders, trying not to cry at the sight of his exhaustion mixed with determination. And the morning of the event, he stood in the doorway, adjusting his shirt collar in the reflection of the glass, the prototype tucked safely in his bag. And when he turned to me, I saw something in him that I had never fully seen before. Resolve that ran deeper than fear, deeper than doubt, deeper even than pain. We drove together because I insisted this time, and though he rolled his eyes softly, he didn't argue. The venue was a large, converted warehouse filled with display tables and mechanical noise and too many people talking at once. The kind of chaotic space that would have shut him down completely a year ago. But now he walked in with slow, steady breaths, grounding himself in the familiar weight of his device. He set up his station quietly, taped his diagrams to the board, placed the motor and sensors in a neat demonstration arc, and waited as people drifted past in waves. First came curiosity, then interest. Then a small circle formed. They asked him questions, some simple, some pointed, and he answered them with a clarity I had never heard from him, as if something in the pressure of the moment pressed language into a shape he could finally use. At one point, a man in a blazer who looked like he lived off coffee and deadlines asked him if he had considered patenting his design. My grandson froze for a moment, not out of ignorance, but out of disbelief, unable to process that the question was serious. Then another man nodded and said the device filled a major gap in diagnostic efficiency, something about early-stage motor failure detection, and that it could save companies enormous sums if developed properly. I saw my grandson's hands tremble again, but not with old fear. This was the tremble of realization, of possibility, of a door opening so wide that light spilled through every crack inside him. He reached for the prototype with newfound certainty and ran the demonstration again, this time with a steady voice, his sentences longer, fuller, carrying the rhythm of someone who had stepped into alignment with his own mind. And as people watched, as they murmured to each other, as they took pictures and wrote notes and asked if he had a card, something inside me loosened so suddenly I had to grip the table to remain upright. Then, as if fate were determined to test the strength he had newly claimed, my son arrived. I hadn't told him about the event, but people talk, and he always found ways to insert himself at the worst possible moments. He approached the booth with a stiff smile that did nothing to hide his irritation, scanning the crowd like he was evaluating a meeting he had not been invited to. He looked at the device with faint mockery, then at his nephew with what he thought was paternal wisdom, and he opened his mouth, ready to dismiss, to correct, to belittle. But before he could say a word, my grandson lifted his hand, not aggressively, not rudely, but firmly, and told him that he was busy, that he had people to talk to, that he would speak with him later. The crowd didn't notice the exchange, but I saw my son freeze, stunned by a boundary he had never expected from the quiet boy he'd spent years underestimating. He opened his mouth again as if to reassert control, but my grandson had already turned away, already demonstrating his device to someone who actually listened, already choosing his audience, already choosing himself. I watched my son's face shift from shock to irritation, to something like fear. The fear of losing authority. The fear of realizing he no longer held power over someone he had dismissed as powerless. And that was the instant, the exact instant, when I knew the world had changed. Not because investors were impressed, not because the device worked beautifully, not even because the future had suddenly widened. It changed because my grandson had looked directly at the person who had defined his limits and walked past him without shrinking. When everything finally calmed down, when the noise of the event had faded from my ears and the rush of adrenaline no longer clouded my thoughts, we drove home in a silence that wasn't heavy, but full. The kind of silence that follows a storm that has rinsed the world clean. My grandson sat in the passenger seat holding the prototype on his lap, with the same gentle caution he'd had since the beginning. But he wasn't curled in on himself the way he used to be, and he wasn't shrinking under the weight of invisible judgments. Instead, he stared out the window with a stillness that felt almost reverent, as if he were seeing familiar streets through new eyes, as if everything that had once seemed unreachable finally sat within arm's length. When we pulled into the driveway, he didn't rush out or retreat to the garage. He simply sat there for a long moment, breathing slowly, adjusting himself to the reality that the world had changed direction beneath his feet. I wanted to say something profound, something about how proud I was or how he had proven every cruel assumption wrong. But the words caught in my throat, not because I couldn't find them, but because I realized he didn't need them anymore. So I reached over and touched his arm lightly, and that small gesture said all the things mothers and grandmothers spend years struggling to articulate. Inside the house, the quiet felt different. It wasn't the quiet of retreat or uncertainty, but a quiet with shape and purpose. A quiet that made room for growth. He placed the device on the table and looked at it with a complicated tenderness, almost like one looks at a child who has suddenly outgrown the need for protection. He told me they had asked him to bring a refined version next month, that someone wanted to talk about early-stage funding, that there were conversations happening he hadn't even dared imagine 2 weeks earlier. He said all of it softly, almost carefully, as though he feared that speaking too loudly might break the fragile boundary between hope and reality. I listened, nodding, not offering advice or caution, because he had stepped into a place where he no longer needed explanations from me, only space and presence, and someone who believed in the solidity of his path. He went to bed early that evening, exhausted in a way that felt earned, and I sat alone in the living room with the lamp casting a soft circle of light. letting myself finally feel the weight of the day. I thought of my son, of the look on his face when the boy set a boundary that could not be undone. And I felt the old ache of motherhood mixed with something sterner, something that whispered that even the people we raise are capable of becoming strangers to us. I knew he would call eventually, with apologies dressed as explanations or explanations disguised as apologies. But I also knew that the power he once held over my grandson had cracked permanently, and that knowledge soothed a part of me I hadn't even realized was raw. Later, long after the house settled into its nocturnal rhythm, I walked into the garage where he had spent so many lonely hours, and I stood in the doorway, taking in the clutter, the tools, the scattered wires, and the stubborn scent of oil. This was where he had learned to believe in his own hands, where he had built something the world had tried to convince him he could never create. It wasn't just a workspace now. It was a testament to every moment he had chosen to continue despite being told he wasn't enough. I touched the edge of the table the same way he always did, grounding myself in its reality, and I felt a soft swell of gratitude, not to fate and not to luck, but to the slow unspooling of time that had finally allowed him to meet himself fully. When I went back inside, I paused at his door and listened to his breathing, steady and deep, the breathing of someone who had finally stepped out of the shadow of other people's expectations. I whispered a small wish into the darkness, not for success or wealth or recognition, though all of that now felt possible in ways that had once seemed improbable, but for peace. The kind of peace that comes when a person no longer needs to apologize for the shape their soul was given. And as I stood there, leaning lightly on the doorframe, I realized that the ending of this story was not an ending at all, but a quiet beginning. The kind of beginning that grows not from triumph, but from resilience. Before I went to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote him a note I didn't plan to give him yet. I wrote that the world is not generous to the gentle, but sometimes the gentle remake the world without raising their voices. I wrote that he had survived the weight of being underestimated, and that survival had turned into strength, the kind that moves slowly but carves through stone. And I wrote, finally, that if he ever doubted himself again, he should remember not the applause or the interest or the possibilities, but that moment when he told his uncle, "Not now," and turned toward people who saw him truly. That moment, I wrote, was the first step into his real life. When I finished, I folded the note and placed it inside my recipe book, knowing one day he would find it, maybe years from now, maybe when he least expects it. Then I turned off the light and let the darkness settle around me with the soft comfort of a well-worn blanket. And as I lay down, I thought of all the women like me, older, quieter, watching over fragile things the world dismisses. And I hoped they would learn, as I had, that belief can be a form of salvation, not loud, not dramatic, but steady enough to lift someone out of the shadows. Because sometimes the slowest among us are simply moving toward a future only they can see. And if we are lucky enough to witness it, our only task is to stand by and let them arrive.